If you're interested in the pivotal moments that shaped American independence, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because we're diving deep into one of the most critical chapters of the Revolutionary War. In September of 1777, the approach to Philadelphia by water remained obstructed by a formidable double set of chevaux de frise stretching across the Delaware River channel. One barrier sat 7 miles from Philadelphia, just below the mouth of the Schuylkill, protected by Fort Mercer at Red Bank on the New Jersey shore and Fort Mifflin on Mud Island. The other barrier lay 5 miles closer to the bay, overlooked by fortifications at Billingsport. On the 2nd of October, a British detachment crossed the Delaware from Chester. The garrison at Billingsport, facing overwhelming force, spiked their guns and fled, leaving the lower line of obstructions to be removed without resistance. This act of abandonment spread a cancer of faint-heartedness along the river. Desertions began flowing from the watercraft and even from the forts themselves, both officers and privates abandoning their posts. Washington understood that he had to act, or despondency would consume what remained of American resistance. The village of Germantown formed a continuous street stretching 2 miles. At its center, it was crossed at right angles by Howe's encampment. The British position extended on the right to a wood and was guarded on the extreme left by Hessian Jaegers positioned at the Schuylkill. The 1st Battalion of Light Infantry and the Queen's American Rangers had been advanced in front of the right wing. The 2nd Battalion supported the farthest pickets of the left at Mount Airy, about 2 miles from the main camp. At the head of the village, in an open field near a large stone house known as the Chew House, the 40th Regiment under the veteran Musgrave had pitched their tents. Intelligence of an intended American attack reached Howe, but he received it with complete incredulity. About noon on the 3rd of October, Washington assembled his forces at Metuchen Hills and announced his purpose to move upon Germantown. He spoke to his men of the successes achieved by the Northern Army and explained that Howe, who lay at a distance of several miles from Cornwallis, had further weakened himself by sending 2 battalions to Billingsport. If the Americans would be brave and patient, Washington told them, he might on the next day lead them to victory. His plan was to direct the chief attack upon the right of the isolated part of the British forces, an approach that seemed relatively easy. For this purpose, he gave Greene command of his left wing, composed of the divisions of Greene and Stephen, flanked by McDougall's brigade. These forces formed about 2/3 of his total strength. The divisions of Sullivan and Wayne, flanked by Conway's brigade and followed by Washington himself, with the brigades of Nash and Maxwell under Lord Stirling held as reserve, assumed the more difficult task of engaging the British left. To create further confusion, the Maryland and New Jersey militia were ordered to make a circuit and come upon the rear of the British right, while on the opposite side, Armstrong with the Pennsylvania militia would strike at the Hessian Jaegers. The different columns received orders to conduct their march of about 14 miles so as to arrive near the enemy in time to rest and to begin the attack on all quarters precisely at 5 o'clock in the morning. The right wing, after marching all night, halted 2 miles in front of the British outpost and took refreshment. Screened by fog and moving in complete silence, the advance party at the appointed hour surprised the British picket. The Battalion of Light Infantry offered resistance, but when Wayne's men, closely followed by Sullivan's division, rushed forward, the bugle sounded retreat. The cannon fire woke Cornwallis in Philadelphia, and he instantly ordered British grenadiers and Hessians to the scene of action. If you're interested in the pivotal moments that shaped American independence, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because we're diving deep into one of the most critical chapters of the Revolutionary War. In September of 1777, the approach to Philadelphia by water remained obstructed by a formidable double set of chevaux de frise stretching across the Delaware River channel. One barrier sat 7 miles from Philadelphia, just below the mouth of the Schuylkill, protected by Fort Mercer at Red Bank on the New Jersey shore and Fort Mifflin on Mud Island. The other barrier lay 5 miles closer to the bay, overlooked by fortifications at Billingsport. On the 2nd of October, a British detachment crossed the Delaware from Chester. The garrison at Billingsport, facing overwhelming force, spiked their guns and fled, leaving the lower line of obstructions to be removed without resistance. This act of abandonment spread a cancer of faint-heartedness along the river. Desertions began flowing from the watercraft and even from the forts themselves, both officers and privates abandoning their posts. Washington understood that he had to act, or despondency would consume what remained of American resistance. The village of Germantown formed a continuous street stretching 2 miles. At its center, it was crossed at right angles by Howe's encampment. The British position extended on the right to a wood and was guarded on the extreme left by Hessian Jaegers positioned at the Schuylkill. The 1st Battalion of Light Infantry and the Queen's American Rangers had been advanced in front of the right wing. The 2nd Battalion supported the farthest pickets of the left at Mount Airy, about 2 miles from the main camp. At the head of the village, in an open field near a large stone house known as the Chew House, the 40th Regiment under the veteran Musgrave had pitched their tents. Intelligence of an intended American attack reached Howe, but he received it with complete incredulity. About noon on the 3rd of October, Washington assembled his forces at Metuchen Hills and announced his purpose to move upon Germantown. He spoke to his men of the successes achieved by the Northern Army and explained that Howe, who lay at a distance of several miles from Cornwallis, had further weakened himself by sending 2 battalions to Billingsport. If the Americans would be brave and patient, Washington told them, he might on the next day lead them to victory. His plan was to direct the chief attack upon the right of the isolated part of the British forces, an approach that seemed relatively easy. For this purpose, he gave Greene command of his left wing, composed of the divisions of Greene and Stephen, flanked by McDougall's brigade. These forces formed about 2/3 of his total strength. The divisions of Sullivan and Wayne, flanked by Conway's brigade and followed by Washington himself, with the brigades of Nash and Maxwell under Lord Stirling held as reserve, assumed the more difficult task of engaging the British left. To create further confusion, the Maryland and New Jersey militia were ordered to make a circuit and come upon the rear of the British right, while on the opposite side, Armstrong with the Pennsylvania militia would strike at the Hessian Jaegers. The different columns received orders to conduct their march of about 14 miles so as to arrive near the enemy in time to rest and to begin the attack on all quarters precisely at 5 o'clock in the morning. The right wing, after marching all night, halted 2 miles in front of the British outpost and took refreshment. Screened by fog and moving in complete silence, the advance party at the appointed hour surprised the British picket. The battalion of light infantry offered resistance, but when Wayne's men, closely followed by Sullivan's division, rushed forward, the bugle sounded retreat. The cannon fire woke Cornwallis in Philadelphia, and he instantly ordered British grenadiers and Hessians to the scene of action.
Care was taken for the removal of every piece of artillery. British and German officers of the first rank judged the attack to have been well planned and acknowledged that no retreat was ever conducted in better order. In the official report of this engagement, the commander-in-chief stated with unsparing exactness the tardy arrival of Greene and the consequences of the failure of coordination under his command. The renewal of an attack so soon after the defeat at Brandywine, however, inspired Congress and the Army with renewed determination. To open the Delaware River, the fleet of Lord Howe between the 4th and 8th of the month anchored between Newcastle and Reedy Island. By the middle of October, a narrow and intricate channel through the lower obstruction in the river had been opened, but the upper set of chevaux de frise remained untouched. The forts on Red Bank and Mud Island, which protected it, were garrisoned by Continental troops. The former was under the command of Colonel Christopher Greene of Rhode Island, the latter under Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Smith of Maryland. Meanwhile, from the necessity of concentrating his force, Howe ordered Sir Henry Clinton to abandon Fort Clinton on the Hudson and to send him a reinforcement of full 6,000 men. He removed his army from Germantown to Philadelphia and raised a line of fortifications from the Schuylkill to the Delaware. On the morning of the 18th, a messenger arrived in the American camp bringing letters from Putnam and Clinton, prematurely but positively announcing the surrender of Burgoyne's army. Washington received them with joy unspeakable and devout gratitude for this signal stroke of Providence. "All will be well," he said, "in his own good time." The news quickly penetrated the British camp, intensifying the urgency of their operations. The difficulty of access to the upper Chevaux de Frise in the Delaware River had delayed its reduction. Under a feeling of exasperated impatience, Sir William Howe gave verbal orders to Colonel Donop, who had expressed a wish for a separate command, to carry Red Bank by assault if it could easily be done. On the 22nd, Donop arrived near the fort with 5 Hessian regiments and their artillery, 4 companies of Jaegers, a few mounted Jaegers, and 2 English howitzers. The fort could be approached on 3 sides through thick woods within 400 yards. It was a pentagon with a high earthen rampart protected in front by an abatis. The battery of 8 3-pounders and 2 howitzers was brought up on the right wing and directed on the embrasures. At the front of each of the 4 battalions selected for the assault stood a captain with carpenters and 100 men bearing fascines. Donop, at 4:30, summoned the garrison in arrogant language. When a defiance was returned, he addressed a few words to his troops. Each colonel placed himself at the head of his division, and at 5:15, under the protection of a brisk cannonade from all their artillery, they ran forward and carried the abatis. On clearing it, they were embarrassed by pitfalls and exposed to terrible fire of small arms and grape shot from a concealed gallery. 2 galleys which the bushes had hidden raked their flanks with chain shot. Yet the brave Hessians formed on the glacis, filled the ditch, and pressed toward the rampart. But Donop, the officers of his staff, and more than half the other officers were killed or wounded. The men who climbed the parapet were beaten down with lances and bayonets. As morning twilight came on, the assailants fell back under the protection of their reserve. Many of the wounded crawled into the forest. Donop and a few others were left behind. The survivors marched back during the night unpursued. As the British ships of war, which had attempted to take part in the attack, fell down the river, the Augusta, a 64-gun ship, and the Merlin frigate ran aground. The next day, the Augusta was set on fire by red-hot shot from American galleys and floating batteries, and blew up before all her crew could escape. The Merlin was abandoned and burned. From the wrecks, the Americans brought off 2 24-pounders. "Thank God," reasoned John Adams, "the glory is not immediately due to the commander-in-chief, or idolatry and adulation would have been so excessive as to endanger our liberties." The Hessians, by their own account, lost in the assault 402 killed and wounded, of whom 26 were officers. 2 colonels gave up their lives. Donop, whose thigh was shattered, lingered for 3 days. To Maudu du Plessis, who watched over his deathbed, he said it was finishing a noble career early, that he died the victim of his ambition and of the avarice of his sovereign. This was the moment chosen by Howe to complain of Lord George Germain, to ask the king's leave to resign his command, and to report that there was no prospect of terminating the war without another campaign, nor then unless large reinforcements should be sent from Europe. Upon Burgoyne's surrender, Gates should instantly have detached reinforcements to Washington, but even the corps of Morgan was not returned. The commander-in-chief, therefore, near the end of October, dispatched Alexander Hamilton with authority to demand the troops. Putnam, for a while, disregarded the orders borne by Hamilton. Gates detained a very large part of his army in idleness at Albany under the pretext of an expedition against Ticonderoga, which he did not mean to attack and which the British had themselves abandoned. He neglected to announce his victory to the commander-in-chief. Instead of chiding the insubordination, Congress appointed Gates to regain the forts and passes on the Hudson River.
Washington had himself recovered these forts and passes by pressing Howe so closely as to compel him to order their evacuation, yet Congress forbade Washington to detach from the Northern Army more than 2,500 men, including the Corps of Morgan, without first consulting General Gates and the governor of New York. It was even moved that he should not detach any troops except after consultation with Gates and Clinton. Samuel Adams, John Adams, and Gerry of Massachusetts, with Marchant of Rhode Island, voted for that restriction. Time was wasted by this interference, while the Northern Army had been borne onward to victory by the rising of the people. Washington, meanwhile, encountered in Pennsylvania internal feuds and a religious sect which forbade its members the use of arms. By the 10th of November, the British had completed their batteries on the reedy morass of Province Island, 500 yards from the American fort on Mud Island, and began an incessant fire from 4 batteries of heavy artillery. Smith gave the opinion that the garrison could not repel a storming party, but Major Fleury, the French engineer, reported the place to be still defensible. On the 11th, Smith, having received a slight hurt, passed immediately to Red Bank. The next in rank desired to be recalled, and early on the 13th, the brave garrison of but 286 fresh men and 20 artillerists was confided to Major Simeon Thayer of Rhode Island, who had distinguished himself in the expedition against Quebec and who now volunteered to take the desperate command.
Directed by Thayer and Fleury, the garrison held out during an incessant bombardment and cannonade. On the 15th, the wind proving fair, the Vigilant, carrying 16 24-pounders, and the hulk of a large Indiaman with 3 24-pounders, aided by the tide, were warped through an inner channel which the obstructions in the river had deepened, and anchored so near the American fort that they could send hand grenades into it. Marksmen from the mast of the Vigilant could pick off men from the platform of the fort. 5 large British ships of war, which drew near the Chevaux de Frise, kept off the American flotilla and sometimes fired on the unprotected side of the fort. The land batteries, now 5 in number, played from 30 pieces at short distances. The ramparts and blockhouses on Mud Island were honeycombed, their cannons nearly silenced. A storming party was prepared, but Sir William Howe, who on the 15th was present with his brother, gave orders to keep up the fire all night through. In the evening, Thayer sent all the garrison but 40 men over to Red Bank, and after midnight followed with the rest. When on the 16th the British troops entered the fort, they found nearly every one of its cannons stained with blood. Never were orders to defend a place to the last extremity more faithfully executed. Thayer was reported to Washington as an officer of the highest merit. Fleury won well-deserved promotion from Congress. Cornwallis was next sent by way of Chester to Billingsport with a strong body of troops to clear the left bank of the Delaware. A division under Greene was promptly dispatched across the river to give battle, but Cornwallis was joined by 5 British battalions from New York, while American reinforcements from the Northern Army were still kept back. It therefore became necessary to evacuate Red Bank. Cornwallis, having leveled its ramparts, returned to Philadelphia, and Greene rejoined Washington, though not until Lafayette, who attended the expedition as a volunteer, had secured the applause of Congress by routing a party of Hessians. For all the seeming success, many officers in the British camp expressed the opinion that the states could not be subjugated. From day to day, the want of a general government was more keenly felt. While the winter quarters of the British in Philadelphia were rendered secure by the possession of the River Delaware, Congress, which was scoffed at in the British House of Lords as a vagrant horde, resumed at Yorktown the work of confederation. Of the committee who, in June 1776, had been appointed to prepare the plan, Samuel Adams alone remained a member, and even he was absent when, on the 15th of November 1777, Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union were adopted to be submitted for approbation to the several states. The present is always the lineal descendant of the past. A new form of political life never appears except as a growth out of its antecedents.
In civil affairs, as much as in husbandry, seed time goes before the harvest, and the harvest may be seen in the seed in the harvest. According to American theory, the unity of the colonies had, before the Declaration of Independence, resided in the British king. The Congress of the United States was the king's successor and inherited only the powers which the colonies themselves acknowledged to have belonged to the crown. The instincts of local attachment had been strengthened by time and by the excellence of the local governments. Affection could not twine itself around a continental domain of which the greater part was wilderness associated with no recollections. The Confederacy was formed under the influence of political ideas which had been developed by a contest of centuries for individual and local liberties against an irresponsible central authority. Now that power had passed to the people, new institutions were required strong enough to protect the Union, yet without impairing the liberties of the state or the individual. But America, misled by what belonged to the past, took for her organizing force the principle of resistance to power, which in all the 13 colonies had been hardened into stubbornness by resistance to oppression. During the 16 months that followed the introduction of the plan for Confederation prepared by Dickinson, the spirit of separation, fostered by uncontrolled indulgence and by opposing interests in institutions, visibly increased in Congress.
Every change in his draft, which of itself proposed only a league of states, diminished the energetic authority which is the first guarantee of liberty. The United States of America included within their jurisdiction all the territory that had belonged to the old 13 colonies, and if Canada would so choose, they were ready to annex Canada. In the republics of Greece, citizenship had in theory been confined to a body of kindred families which formed a hereditary caste, a multitudinous aristocracy. Such a system could have no permanent vitality, and the Greek republics, as the Italian republics in later ages, died out for want of citizens. America adopted the principle of the all-embracing unity of society. As the American territory was that of the old 13 colonies, so the free people residing upon it formed the free people of the United States. Subject and citizen were correlative terms. Subjects of the monarchy became citizens of the republic. He that had owed primary allegiance to the King of England now owed primary allegiance to united America. Yet, as the republic was the sudden birth of a revolution, the moderation of Congress did not name it treason for the former subjects of the king to adhere to his government. Only it was held that whoever chose to remain on the soil by residence accepted protection and owed allegiance. This is the reason why for 12 years free inhabitants and citizens were in American state papers convertible terms, sometimes used one for the other and sometimes for the sake of perspicuity redundantly joined together. The King of England claimed as his subjects all persons born within his dominions. In like manner, everyone who first saw the light on American soil was a natural-born American citizen. But the power of naturalization, which under the king each colony had claimed to regulate by its own laws, remained under the Confederacy with the separate states. The king had extended protection to every one of his lieges in every one of the 13 colonies. Now that Congress was the successor of the king in America, the right to equal protection was continued to every free inhabitant in whatever state he might sojourn or dwell. It had been held under the monarchy that each American colony was as independent of England as the electorate of Hanover. In the Confederacy of the United States of America, each state was to remain an independent sovereign, and the Union was to be no more than an alliance. This theory decided the manner in which Congress should vote. Pennsylvania and Virginia asked that while each state might have at least one delegate, the rule should be one for every 50,000 inhabitants. But the amendment was rejected by 9 states against 2, Delaware being absent and North Carolina divided. Virginia would have allowed to each state one member of Congress for every 30,000 of its inhabitants, and in this she was supported by John Adams, but his colleagues cast the vote of Massachusetts against it, and Virginia was left alone, North Carolina, as before, being equally divided. Virginia, again supported by John Adams, desired that the representation for each state should be in proportion to its contribution to the public treasury. But this was opposed by every other state, including North Carolina and Massachusetts. At last, with only one state divided and no negative voice but that of Virginia, an equal vote in Congress was acknowledged to belong to each sovereign state. The number of delegates to give that vote might be not less than 2, nor more than 7 for each state. The remedy for this inequality enhanced the evil and foreboded anarchy. While each state had one vote, great and very interesting questions could be carried only by the concurrence of 9 states. If the advice of Samuel Adams had been listened to, the vote of 9 states would not have prevailed unless they represented a majority of the people of all the states. For the transaction of less important business, an affirmative vote of 7 states was required. In other words, in the one case, the assent of 2/3 of all the states, in the other, of a majority of them all, was needed, the absence of any state having the force of a negative vote.
The king's right to levy taxes in the colonies by Parliament or by his prerogative had been denied, and no more than a power to make requisitions had been conceded. In like manner, it was assumed as a fundamental article that the United States in Congress assembled shall never impose or levy any tax or duties, but only make requisitions for money on the several states. This restriction, such was the force of usage, was accepted without remark. No one explained the distinction between a superior power wielded by a hereditary king in another hemisphere and a superior power which should be the chosen expression of the will and reason of the nation. The country had broken with the past in declaring independence. It went back into bondage to the past in forming its first constitution. The king might establish a general post office, it had been held, for public convenience, not for a purpose of revenue. In like manner, Congress might authorize rates of postage to defray the expense of transporting the mails. The colonies under the king had severally levied import and export duties. The same power was reserved to each separate state, to be limited only by the proposed treaties with France and Spain. The new republic was left without any independent revenue, and the charges of the government, its issues of paper money, its loans, were to be ultimately defrayed through requisitions for the quotas assessed upon the separate states. The difference between the North and the South growing out of the institution of slavery decided the rule for the distribution of these quotas. By the draft of Dickinson, taxation was to be in proportion to the census of population in which slaves were to be enumerated. On the 13th of October, 1777, it was moved that the sum to be paid by each state into the treasury should be ascertained by the value of all property within each state. This was promptly negated and was followed by a motion having for its object to exempt slaves from taxation altogether. On the following day, 11 states were present. The 4 of New England voted in the negative. Maryland, Virginia, and the 2 Carolinas voted in the affirmative. Robert Morris of Pennsylvania voted against Roberdeau, and Dewar of New York voted against Duane with the South, and so the votes of their states were divided and lost. The decision rested on New Jersey, and she gave it for the complete exemption from taxation of all property in slaves. This is the first important division between slaveholding states and the states where slavery was of little account. The rule for apportioning the revenue as finally adopted was the respective value of land granted or surveyed and the buildings and improvements thereon, without regard to personal property or numbers. This rendered the Confederacy nugatory, for Congress had not power to make the valuation. In like manner, the rules for navigation were to be established exclusively by each separate state, and the Confederation did not take to itself power to countervail the restrictions of foreign governments or to form agreements of reciprocity or even to establish uniformity. These arrangements suited the opinions of the time.
The legislature of New Jersey, vexed by the control of New York over the waters of New York Bay, alone proposed as an amendment a grant of greater power over foreign commerce. Moreover, each state decided for itself what imports it would permit and what it would prohibit. As a consequence, the Confederate Congress was left without power to sanction or to stop the slave trade. The king had possessed all land not alienated by royal grants. On the Declaration of Independence, the royal quit rents ceased to be paid, and each state assumed the ownership of the royal domain within its limits. The validity of the Act of Parliament which transferred the region northwest of the Ohio to the province of Quebec was denied by all, but the states which by their charters extended indefinitely west or west and northwest refused to accept the United States as the umpire to settle their boundaries except with regard to each other. Jealousy of a standing army and the superiority of the civil over the military power were among the dearest traditions of English liberty. It was borne in mind that victorious legions revolutionized Rome, that Charles I sought to overturn the institutions of England by an army, that by an army Charles II was brought back without conditions, that by a standing army which Americans themselves were to have been taxed to maintain, it had been proposed to abridge American liberties. In Congress, this distrust of military power existed all the more for the confidence and undivided affection which the people bore to the American commander-in-chief, and has for its excuse that human nature was hardly supposed able to furnish an example of a military liberator of his country, desirous after finishing his work to go into private life. We have seen how earnestly Washington endeavored to establish an army of the United States.
His plan, which at the time it was proposed Congress did not venture to reject, was now deliberately demolished. To prevent a homogeneous organization, it not only left to each of them the exclusive power over its militia, but the exclusive appointment of the regimental officers in its quota of land forces for the general service. As in England, so in America, this jealousy did not extend to maritime affairs. The separate states had no share in the appointment of officers in the Navy. As the king in England, so the United States determined on peace and war, sent ambassadors to foreign powers, and entered into treaties and alliances. But beside their general want of executive power, the grant to make treaties of commerce was limited by the power reserved to the states over imports and exports, over shipping and revenue. The right of coining money, the right of keeping up ships of war, land forces, forts, and garrisons were shared by Congress with the respective states. No state, Massachusetts not more than South Carolina, would subordinate its law of treason to the will of Congress. The formation of a class of national statesmen was impeded by the clause which forbade any man to sit in Congress more than 3 years out of 6, nor could the same member of Congress be appointed its president more than 1 year in any term of 3 years. No executive distinct from the General Congress could be detected in the system. Judicial power over questions arising between the states was provided for, and courts might be established to exercise primary jurisdiction over crimes committed on the high seas with appellate jurisdiction over captures. But there was scarcely the rudiment of a judiciary from which a court for executing the ordinances of Congress could be developed. Congress was incapable of effectual supervision over officers of its own appointment and in its own service. The report of Dickinson provided for a council, but this was narrowed down to a committee of states to be composed of 1 delegate from each state with no power whatever respecting important business and no power of any kind except that with which Congress, by the consent of 9 states, might invest them from time to time. Each state retained its sovereignty and all power not expressly delegated. Under the King of England, the use of the veto in colonial legislation had been complained of. There was not even a thought of vesting Congress with a veto on the legislation of states or subjecting such legislation to the revision of a judicial tribunal. Each state, being esteemed independent and sovereign, had exclusive, full, and final powers in every matter relating to domestic police and government, to slavery and manumission, to the conditions of the elective franchise. The restraints required to secure loyalty to the central government were left to be self-imposed.
Incidental powers to carry into effect the powers granted to the United States were withheld. To complete the security against central authority, the Articles of Confederation were not to be adopted except by the assent of every one of the legislatures of the 13 separate states, and no amendment might be made without the unanimity of its members. A government which had not power to levy a tax, or raise a soldier, or deal directly with an individual, or keep its engagements with foreign powers, or amend its constitution without the unanimous consent of its members, had not enough of vital force to keep itself alive. But a higher spirit moved over the darkness of that formless void. Notwithstanding the defects of the Confederation, the Congress of the United States, inspired by the highest wisdom of the 18th century and seemingly without debate, embodied in their work 4 capital results which Providence, in its love for the human race, could not let die. The republics of Greece and Rome had been essentially no more than governments of cities. When Rome exchanged the narrowness of the ancient municipality for cosmopolitan expansion, the republic, from the false principle on which it was organized, became an empire.
The Middle Ages had free towns and cantons, but no national republic. Congress had faith that one republican government could comprehend a continental territory, even though it should extend from the Gulf of Mexico to the uttermost limit of Canada and the eastern limit of Newfoundland. Having thus proclaimed that a republic may equal the widest empire in its bounds, the relation of the United States to the natural rights of their inhabitants was settled with superior wisdom. Some of the states had, each according to its prevailing superstition or prejudice, narrowed the rights of classes of men. One state disfranchised Jews, another Catholics, another deniers of the Trinity, another men of a complexion different from white. The United States in Congress assembled, suffering the errors in one state to eliminate the errors in another, rejected every disfranchisement and superadded none. The Declaration of Independence said all men are created equal. By the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, free inhabitants were free citizens. That which gave reality to the Union was the article which secured to the free inhabitants of each of the states all privileges and immunities of free citizens in the several states. Congress appeared to shun the term people of the United States. It is nowhere found in their Articles of Confederation, and rarely and only accidentally in their votes. Yet by this act they constituted the free inhabitants of the different states one people. When the Articles of Confederation reached South Carolina for confirmation, it was perceived that they secured equal rights of intercitizenship in the several states to the free black inhabitant of any state. This concession was opposed in the legislature of South Carolina, and after an elaborate speech by William Henry Drayton, the Articles were returned to Congress with a recommendation that intercitizenship should be confined to the white man. But Congress, by a vote of 8 states against South Carolina and Georgia, one state being divided, refused to recede from the universal system on which American institutions were to be founded. The decision was not due to impassioned philanthropy. Slavery at that day existed in every one of the 13 states, and notwithstanding many men, South as well as North, revolted at the thought of continuing the institution, custom scarcely recognized the black man as an equal. Yet Congress, with a fixedness of purpose resting on a principle, would not swerve from its position, for when it resolved upon independence and had to decide on whom a demand could be made to maintain that independence, it defined as members of a colony all persons abiding within it and deriving protection from its laws. Now, therefore, when interstate rights were to be confided to the members of each state, it looked upon every free man who owed primary allegiance to the state as a citizen of the state. The free black inhabitant owed allegiance and was entitled to equal civil rights, and so was a citizen.
Congress, while it left the regulation of the elective franchise to the judgment of each state, in the Articles of Confederation, in its votes and its treaties with other powers, reckoned all the free inhabitants without distinction of ancestry, creed, or color as subjects or citizens. But America, though the best representative of the social and political acquisitions of the 18th century, was not the parent of the idea in modern civilization that man is a constituent member of the state of his birth, irrespective of his ancestry. It was already the public law of Christendom. Had America done less, she would have been a laggard among the nations. One other life-giving excellence distinguished the Articles of Confederation. The instrument was suffused with the idea of securing the largest liberty to individual man. In the ancient Greek Republic, the state existed before the individual and absorbed the individual. Thought, religious opinion, worship, conscience, amusements, joys, sorrows, all activities were regulated by the state. The individual lived only as an integral part of the state. A declaration of rights is a declaration of those liberties of the individual which the state cannot justly control. The Greek system of law knew nothing of such liberties. The Greek citizen never spoke of the rights of man. The individual was merged in the body politic. At last, a government founded on consent could be perfected, for the acknowledgement that conscience has its rights had broken up the unity of despotic power and confirmed the freedom of the individual. Because there was life in all the parts, there was the sure promise of a well-organized life in the whole. Yet the young republic failed in its first effort at forming a general union. The smoke in the flame overpowered the light. The Articles of Confederation endeavored to reconcile a partial sovereignty in the Union with complete sovereignty in the states, to subvert a mathematical axiom by taking away a part and letting the whole remain. The polity then formed could hardly be called an organization, so little did the parts mutually correspond and concur to the same final actions. The system was imperfect and was acknowledged to be imperfect. A better one could not then have been accepted, but with all its faults, it contained the elements for the evolution of a more perfect union. The sentiment of nationality was forming. The framers of the Confederacy would not admit into that instrument the name of the people of the United States, and described the states as so many sovereign and independent communities. Yet already in the circular letter of November 1777 to the states asking their several subscriptions to the plan of Confederacy, they avowed the purpose to secure to the inhabitants of all the states an existence as a free people. The child that was then born was cradled between opposing powers of evil. If it will live, its infant strength must strangle the twin serpents of separatism and central despotism. Before you go, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the moments that forged America.